afternoon, everyone, again. I hope that you are refreshed. We are about to begin the second part of this afternoon's proceedings, the Politics of Location, Caribbean Perspectives, Archives in the Diaspora. And I would like to introduce Heather Dean, who is going to be speaking who's going to consider the Caribbean archives held at the Beinec. And Heather is an archivist at the Beinec Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University and a founding member of the Group for Literary Archives and Manuscripts. Our second speaker is Lillian Manzor, who is an associate professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at the University of Miami College of Arts and Sciences, and the founding director of the Cuban Theater Digital Archive. So without any further delay,
good afternoon. I wanted to begin by thanking the organizers. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm so delighted to have had the privilege to hear the conversations taking place this morning. And I look forward to the continuities between our talks this afternoon and tomorrow as well. So now it's my turn to battle with the PowerPoint, so we'll see how I do. With its major collecting focus on North America, the United Kingdom, and Europe, at first glance, the Caribbean is not obviously a region of interest to the Beinec Rare Book and Manuscript Library. However, delving deeper, the library does have a remarkable number of printed materials, personal and family papers, and business records spanning from the 16th to the 20th centuries that directly pertain to the Caribbean. There is a shift over time from material about the Caribbean and its peoples to books by Caribbean authors. The voices transform from explorers and colonizers to Caribbean peoples, just as the types of documents evolve from historical records to literary archives. Material about Caribbean history and culture spans across the Beinec's collecting areas, whether in the disciplines of the general collection, including its early books and manuscripts, or the Yale collection of American literature. And so rather than focus on these collecting areas, I'd like to provide more of a chronological overview of the Caribbean material in the Beinec Library. And I'll just select a few highlights and talk about some of the library's holdings in these particular areas with some observations regarding collections' provenance and their scholarly value. And it came up earlier, we were talking about cultural institutions as sites for tourism. And this is a picture of the Beinec Library. And it's one of the hottest spots for tourists coming to Yale campus to visit on their trip. So there is actually potential for libraries to be a drawing point for tourists. And before focusing on the collections at the Beinec Library, I did want to emphasize that the library is one of several cultural institutions at Yale University, with collections pertaining to the Caribbean. And other campus libraries and museums with Caribbean holdings, and in particular, primary sources include the Sterling Memorial Library, the Lewis Walpole Library, which specializes in 18th century British materials, the Divinity Library, the Yale University Art Gallery, the Yale Center for British Art, and the Peabody Museum of Natural History, and these are just a few. Materials acquired by our colleagues range from archives, manuscripts, maps, rare books, newspapers, and printed ephemera, to paintings, prints, drawings, photographs, objects, and audiovisual media. Scholars of the Caribbean are also served and supported by a number of groups on campus, and these include the Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies, and Critical Line, a graduate reading group in Caribbean Studies. So, each section that I'm going to speak about, I've created a word cloud, and these word clouds are drawn from the subject headings used to describe the holdings that I'm going to speak to for each particular time period. And the reason I wanted to do that is because these kind of give you a general sense of the type of topics that are covered within each particular time period. The Beinec Library's 16th century holdings reflect European exploration, expansion, and colonialism in the Americas, and they offer invaluable insight on the region during this period, as well as the history of navigation and geography in general. The library does not have archives related to the Caribbean from this period, but it does include in its collection exceptionally rare discovery literature. This period of exploration in the Americas resulted in travel narratives on the region, many of which included some of the first maps of the area. And two examples are works from 1507 and 1534. Martin Waldseemüller, a German cartographer, produced Cosmographiae Introductio, or an introduction to cosmography, to accompany his globe and wall map of the world. Sometimes called America's birth certificate, the map and its accompanying book represent the first scholarship to use the name America, and the first to show the new territory as a separate continent or a separate landmass. And this is significant because up until this point, it was believed that the world was comprised of three continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia. And Waldseemüller chose America in recognition of the Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci. Part 1 of Pietro Martiri d'Angera's De Orbe Novo, On the New World, which was published in 1534, includes early maps of Caribbean islands such as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Angera was an Italian-born historian of Spain during the Age of Exploration, and while not an explorer himself, he is notable for his work to document Spanish discovery, conquest, and colonization. And he collected documents and interviewed those who had firsthand experience in the Americas. These two works are examples of early European exploration in the Caribbean that preface territorial disputes and colonialism in later periods. And they're significant in that they represented the Caribbean to Europeans who did not have firsthand experience of the Americas. And so they shaped popular perceptions of the region. And it's believed that Angera's De Orbo Novo actually was an inspiration for Shakespeare when he was writing his play The Tempest, and it had been translated by Richard Eden into English. The 17th and 18th centuries represent a period of colonialism in the Caribbean, where several European nations struggling for power. Archives from this period document the Atlantic slave trade, territorial disputes between competing monarchies, and the exploitation of Caribbean land and peoples in the plantation economy. The Beinec Library's holdings from this period are particularly strong on English history, and these collections are well complemented by the exceptional depth of material at the Yale Center for British Art and the Lewis Walpole Library. And as a group, these collections extend far beyond literature to document political, cultural, and economic history in the broadest sense, including the British transatlantic. They also relate to the American Revolution, and given France's interest in and support of the American Revolution, there's actually quite a lot of material that relates to France's colonial interests in the Caribbean. The archives from this period reflect the colonial perspective, whether that of administrators based in Europe, members of the military stationed in the Caribbean, West Indian planters, and slave owners who played a crucial and often brutal role in the day-to-day operations of plantation life. The William Blathwayt Papers contain correspondence, newsletters, diplomatic papers, and reports documenting Blathwayt's career and English colonial policies in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Most notably, he served in a number of positions with the Lords of Trade and Plantation, an administrative body organized by Charles II to manage colonial affairs, including pertinent legislation and the appointment of regional officers and administrators. The Blathwayt Papers contain correspondence with various government officials, such as the Secretary of State James Vernon's letters. And his letters date from 1697 to 1699, and they discuss events in North America, including a problem with pirates. And so there's a number of letters from 1699 where he refers to Captain Kidd, who's a notorious, believed to have been pirate, but now history's delving into that and finding that that is not entirely the case. Recent scholars of the Blathwaite papers have included a curator from the National Trust who is responsible for overseeing Blathwaite's country home, Durham Park. And what he's interested in exploring is the ways in which Blathwaite incorporated materials from the colonies in his reconstruction and repairs that he was doing to his country home. So he has black walnut from Virginia and cedar from Bermuda as just a few examples. Other papers at the Beinec Library provide the perspective of planters and slave owners in the British Caribbean, especially Jamaica. The Ralph Payne Baron Lavington papers open a window on the life of a wealthy West Indian planter, Baron Lavington, and he was born in St. Kitts, and he divided his time between England and the Caribbean. And his papers shed light on the history of the Caribbean sugar trade, including documentation of land and slave ownership and estate management in the West Indies in the late 18th centuries. And these papers, they provide some insight into the activities of Ralph Payne. But what's more notable are the Thomas Thistlewood papers for really providing the perspective of a plantation and slave owner. And I'll jump to these now. So these have received tremendous attention within the scholarly community, and they provide insight into the life of a Jamaican planter and slave owner to a degree that before this had never really been found, as far as I understand. The papers consist of diaries, weather journals, commonplace books, reading notes, and other material documenting the life, work, and the intellectual interests of Thistlewood. Topics include his role as an overseer and later as an owner of slaves, and these include his method of assigning work, allotting provisions and discipline, his personal and sexual relationships with slaves, including an ongoing affair with one woman in particular, Phoeba, and slave rebellions and rumors of rebellions, including Tacky's revolt in 1760. Thistlewood's exacting and unflinching reporting provides scholars with insight into slavery and plantation life, as well as data elucidating Jamaican agriculture, commerce, and natural history during this period. And the papers had originally been part of the collection of William John Monson, Baron Monson, and he had ancestors who owned a plantation in Jamaica. And the papers were originally put on deposit at the Lincolnshire Archives in 1951 as part of the Monson family papers. And when Monson died in 2011, the Thistlewood papers were auctioned by Sotheby's London, and the Beinec was fortunate enough to purchase the papers at that point. And the Beinec to this point has fully digitized 2 of the diaries from the papers, and as I understand, there's plans to continue this digitization program so that the papers will be more widely available online. Some of the collections at the Beinec Library document wars and territorial disputes which took place in the Caribbean during the 18th century. And the Samuel Barrington letter books contain incoming correspondence kept by Barrington while serving as a rear admiral in the British West Indies. And subjects include Barrington's secret orders to attack St. Lucia, intelligence on the French fleet, and the preparations for the Battle of Grenada, as well as prisoner exchanges with the French Navy and the defensive requirements of the West Indies and the fears of their inhabitants. And this is a portrait of Barrington that's from, I believe, the Yale Center for British Art. And so this is an example of where the Beinec might have the papers belonging to a family or a person, and then that's complemented by holdings elsewhere. So there might be a portrait or other material relating to that person held in another institutional archives, either on campus or elsewhere. The library also has collections reflecting French colonial interests, as I mentioned earlier, during the 18th century. And one of these collections is documents relating to the French participation in the American Revolution, which in a way is a bit of an opaque title. You wouldn't necessarily know that there's material relating to the Caribbean in this collection. But it does include papers concerning France's role in the Caribbean and its alliance with the Spanish forces and the French rule of Santo Domingo after the Treaty of Paris. The Rochambeau papers and the Rochambeau family cartographic archive have papers relating to the Comte de Rochambeau's son, who served as a military commander in the French West Indies. And the Louise Marie de la Revelière-les-Puy papers, like those of William Blathwaite, provide the perspective of a bureaucrat concerned with his country's colonial interests, and in this case, the French control of Guadeloupe and French Guyana. Just as exploration fueled the imagination of authors during the 16th century, European exploits in the Caribbean during the 17th and 18th centuries inspired writers who themselves had not necessarily traveled to the Caribbean. And one such writer was Daniel Defoe, and it's believed that his Robinson Crusoe was a castaway on an island near Trinidad. And the Beinec has an extensive Defoe collection, which was originally formed and given by Henry C. Hutchins. And this includes more than 300 editions of Robinson Crusoe, as well as hundreds of titles that are attributed to Defoe. And so this is an example of a later edition of Robinson Crusoe that has an image, a frontispiece with it, or title page with it, that gives you a sense of how they imagined Crusoe would have fared in the Caribbean. During the 19th century, there is more focused debate regarding slavery. Extended trade between the Caribbean and the United States, which existed in tandem with the plantation economy, can be traced in the archives of merchant marines and other businessmen. And this period is also remarkable for the development of photography. For the first time, the Caribbean is portrayed through the lens of those living and visiting the region, albeit largely from the perspective of those wealthy enough to afford access to that new and revolutionary technology. The legality of the slave trade and slavery and the rise of abolitionism during the late 18th and 19th centuries are well documented in the collections. During the 19th century, England and other European nations ultimately deemed the slave trade and slavery illegal, and the archives reveal both sides of the debates that unfolded at this time. So, for example, the manuscript that I have up here is Thomas Carlyle's complicated essay, Occasional Discourse on the Nigger Question, of which the Beinec has a working draft. And in this paper, he argues against the emancipation of West Indian slaves. And the reason I say that it's complicated is because, from what I understand, this piece originally started out as a devil's advocate piece, where Carlyle was trying to point out to those arguing against slavery, there's kind of this double standard of arguing against slavery but not actually recognizing the plight of the poor and working classes in the UK. And so he felt he was trying to draw attention to this issue. The library owns a number of printed items, diaries, commonplace books, and manuscripts that provide evidence of slavery as well as debates surrounding its abolition. And among them are an engraving of the hold of the British slave ship Brooks, and this was first published by the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1788. And this is important for providing a graphic evidence of the brutality of the slave trade, and this helped to galvanize the abolitionist movement. The Beinec also has a manuscript of Montgomery James's abolitionist poem, The Ocean, and one collection, Documents Relating to the Portuguese Slave Trade, includes a manuscript pertaining to British attempts to suppress the Portuguese slave trade, as seen, for example, in the Palmerston Act of 1839. Territorial disputes during the 17th and 18th centuries continued into the 19th century, albeit with some new powers coming to fore. And the Beinec has several collections relating to American and British military presence in the Caribbean, including material documenting the U.S.'s seizure of Puerto Rico and Cuba and occupation of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And the George Usher papers reveal Usher's diplomatic and commercial work while serving as the Haitian consul in New York between 1859 and 1867. The William Walker Whitehall Johnson photograph album, which you see here, and the Henry Duncan Grant watercolor sketches and scrapbooks comprise visual resources created while both men were serving in the military in the British transatlantic. And I don't know much about the history of this period, but it does strike me as interesting that those serving in the military actually had time to take photographs while they were on duty or to produce watercolors. So I'm not sure if this is something about the shift in the type of military disputes that were happening in the 18th century compared to the 19th century. And in addition, the archives for this period reflect the colonial administrators and planters. So there's a shift from colonial administrators and planters to merchant marines, and businessmen. So again, business is starting to shift slightly in this period. The Stevens family papers document American commercial interests in the Caribbean, and this includes records of prominent New York family involved in the West Indian and Caribbean trade. And Henry Cloyd Bradley Shalder's An Illustrated Account of Sombrero Island describes mining operations for phosphate of lime in the West Indies. And so the document here is an example of the notebook that he kept while he was doing his work, looking at the possibility of doing mining in the West Indies. The Beinec Library's Caribbean collections from the 20th century reflect the Caribbean diaspora, with representation of Caribbean and Caribbean American authors. The holdings for this period, more than any other, are rich in literary collections. So we see a notable shift from material about the Caribbean to work by Caribbean authors. The library has collected first editions of contemporary writers such as Austin Clarke, Edwidge Danticat, Jamaica Kincaid, Claude McKay, V.S. Naipaul, and Andrew Salkey. The literary papers of Caribbean authors can also be found, although again, this is not historically one of the library's collecting areas. And one example, or several examples, are drawn from the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection of African American Arts and Letters. And these contain the papers of several writers with Caribbean connections. But they were ultimately acquired not because they were Caribbean, but because there is some connection with the U.S. The Claude McKay collection consists of letters, manuscripts, personal papers, subject files, photographs, and memorabilia that document the life and work of the Jamaican-born writer. His Songs of Jamaica was the first published book of poetry in patois, and his novel, Home to Harlem, was the first title by an African-American to become a popular bestseller. And I'll note that in all the sources I read, everyone always says that he was an African-American writer. No one ever says that he was, for example, Caribbean-American writer. So there's a certain claiming, I think, that's happening there. The McKay collection was acquired primarily by purchasing gifts from his daughter, Ruth Hope McKay Virtue. And this is actually quite common in the collections that the Beinec has, that they are both purchased and gifted. And so I think it's interesting in thinking about the conversations earlier today where it often seems to be one or the other, where the archive's either donated or it's bought in its entirety. And we found that an archive might come in over a period of time, and sometimes we buy it, sometimes it's gifted, sometimes it's a combination. So I think that there's like quite a few nuances to think of there when we're considering how institutions can go about acquiring material. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. Recently, scholars have used the correspondence in the collection to authenticate an unidentified manuscript, which was mentioned earlier. And this was a manuscript for a 1941 novel by McKay called Amiable with Big Teeth. And the scholars that were researching and trying to authenticate this manuscript looked at correspondence in the McKay papers, and they found what they called the smoking gun in the McKay papers, which essentially was some correspondence that indicated that McKay indeed had authored this novel. The Zora Neale Hurston collection includes drafts of her book Tell My Horse, which is a collection of Caribbean folklore. James Weldon Johnson and Walter White, both of whom balanced their creative work with political and social activism, were especially interested in Haiti. And as his papers illustrate, Johnson traveled to Haiti to investigate conditions on the island, and he published a series of articles in The Nation, and they were later collected and reprinted in his volume, Self-Determining Haiti. Walter White also campaigned on behalf of Haiti, and his papers include correspondence with a number of national political figures, including Paul Eugene Magloire, and White's own writings concerning the country. Beyond the James Weldon Johnson collection, there are several collections relating to Caribbean authors and literature. Zenaida Gutierrez Vega donated to the Beinec Library documents reflecting the work of Cuban-born literary critic and academic Jose Maria Chacon y Calvo, and she collected these during her research. The Beinec also has a draft of Edouard Glissant's La Lézarde, which was published by Editions du Sol in 1958. The papers of William Carlos Williams, whose mother was from Puerto Rico, include drafts of his translations of the writings of Hispanic Caribbean poets Luis Páez Matos and Eugenio Florit. A number of American authors whose papers are at the Beinec Library have also been inspired by the Caribbean, and this includes Nelson Hayes, who set his Caribbean junket Dildo Cay and Spansold there, and the poet Barbara Howes, who published the anthology From the Green Antilles, Writings of the Caribbean, and she published this in 1966. So while not as much as in the past, the West Indies are currently a collecting area of interest for the Beinec, with acquisitions being made in all curatorial disciplines. So this is a rare case where different curatorial areas are actually coming together to collect material from this region. In addition, there are going to be 3 exhibitions coming this fall, just in time for the next Diasporic Literary Archives Conference, that will highlight Caribbean collections at Yale and will feature material that I have spoken about today. So these include the Lewis Walpole Library, and this is an exhibition that's being organized by a professor in the African American Studies Department, Hazel Carby, with her graduate student, Heather Vermillion. Or I'm sorry, I think this is the Lewis Walpole Library. And so this is the library that I mentioned specializes in 18th century literature, and this is actually 40 minutes from New Haven. So if there's interest, then we'll have to talk about organizing transportation up there. The Yale Center for British Art will also be having an exhibition this fall. And this is on figures of empire, slavery, and portraiture in 18th century Atlantic Britain. And in addition to these 2 institutions, the Beinec Library itself will be holding an exhibition with material reflecting the British transatlantic. So this fall, the Beinec Library will... The Beinec Library will be celebrating the James Marshall and Mary Louise Osborne collection of English literary and historical manuscripts, and these date from the Anglo-Saxon period right up until the 20th century. And this exhibition will highlight the British transatlantic of one of the key collecting areas within this collection. And in fact, all 3 exhibitions are going to draw material from the Thistlewood papers. So this is an example of how the Thistlewood papers are being used quite extensively locally, but within the bigger scholarly community as well. So scholars of the Caribbean have access to an array of resources at the Beinec Library and at Yale University in general. And in fact, the wealth of primary source material documenting the Caribbean might actually raise questions about cultural property and where collections rightfully belong. And I don't want to sidestep this question because I think it's important to deal with it head on, but I think it's important to contextualize these issues. So what I'd like to consider is the diasporic nature of these archives and the resulting complexities. So for the most part, Caribbean collections at the Beinec reflect the region's colonial past, with archives from the 16th to the 19th century representing the colonial perspective, whether that of explorers, government officials, slave owners, planters, merchant marines, and so on. In the 20th century, there's a shift from colonial archives to archives of the Caribbean diaspora who are living and working in the US. The region is notable for its multiplicities of countries, of histories, of languages, of cultures, and so on. And there's also a strong connection, a shared history between, like many other places, between the Caribbean and Europe and the United States. So Pietre Martire d'Angera was an Italian-born historian of Spain and its discoveries in the New World. Thomas Thistlewood was born in England, but at the age of 29, he immigrated to Jamaica, where he spent the remaining 36 years of his life. Claude McKay was born in Jamaica, and he moved to the US, but he also spent extended periods of time in Russia and England. So this is not to say that these papers either do or do not belong in the Caribbean, but to draw attention to the complexity of these individuals' lives and their relationship to geography and to nationality. So perhaps it is in part that these nuances with these people's lives that have made the Caribbean collections at the Beinec Library such a rich resource for scholars. They support a work of a number of patrons, from medievalists to contemporary literary critics, in their study of literature, history, art history, and natural history, to name a few. So what I wanted to do was end on this image of the Caribbean, because the Caribbean holdings at the Beinec, as I mentioned with photography being an issue that comes up in the 19th century, you can see this trajectory of record keeping developing over this time and record production. So we start with really quite rudimentary maps of the Caribbean region, and then we start to see more sophisticated representations of the Caribbean. What I like about this image in particular, though, is that it's showing the different navigational routes between the Caribbean and the rest of the world. And I think that's something to really keep in mind with this region, is that there really are these deep connections with other regions in the world. So I think I'll end it on that. Thank you.
Thank you.